أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعد الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. عظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا أبي عبد الله الحسين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. How does the ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alih begin to implement this radical Islamic eco-theology, eco-ethics and eco-ahkam? Over these nights, we have been reflecting on the system of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both at the level of the universe and also our role in it. So much has been spoken about our relationship to the environment, and many different points have been made about where we can begin, what our responsibilities are, what the urgent challenges are that are facing us. What do we think we can do to be able to implement this movement going forward, allowing us to be able to move towards the conclusion of our series? In Islam, we have what is known as Isalat al-Nizam, the principle of organization. In our houses, we realize that for us to be able to get the very best out of the space that we live in, there needs to be organization. When things are disorganized, this is firstly a reflection of ourselves, but also limits the way in which we are able to live. In our own houses, we realize that there are certain rooms, features for certain things. We realize that we have our cupboards that allows us to be able to put our clothes away. If we imagine beyond our own houses, in Islam, is there a subject, is there a topic which allows us to be able to think about the organization of anything in this world, from the way in which we organize the world, the way in which we organize a nation state, the way in which we organize a city, to even the way in which we organize this majlis of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam? Does the religion speak of this? Actually, it does. Our contemporary maraji', ulama, may Allah bless them, have created a new topic, a new principle that allows all of those ayat and those ahadith pertaining to the organization of the ummah, the organization of a country, the organization of even a town and city, as well as even an organization of the majlis itself. And this is what is known as Isalat al-Nizam, the principle of organization, the principle of the way in which we organize the systems of our life. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites us to live a particular life. This is what is known as hayatun tayyibah, a most pure and godly way of living. Everything that we encounter, everything that we engage in is supposed to be at the highest level, which is the tayyibat. In the Quran, Allah Jalla Jalaluhu addresses the prophets as the same way in which He addresses the mu'mineen and the mu'minat. The prophets, He will tell them, Ya ayyuhar rusul, O messengers, kulu min at-tayyibat, partake from the pure things. Elsewhere in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the mu'mineen. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, kulu min at-tayyibat. O you who believe, partake from the pure things. Number one, what we find is that when Allah Jalla Jalaluhu addresses the prophets and the messengers, He addresses the believers in the same way. In the idea that the expectations placed upon us is not lower, is not different than what He addresses the prophet. The same way in which He tells the prophets to live, He expects us, the mu'mineen, to also be able to live. If we are living below the ways of the prophets, drag yourself up such that you are now on par with the prophets and the messengers and the Ahlulbayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. Number one. Number two, what is that level? Is it simply the things that are permissible for you? No. Is it things that are mustahab for you? No. It is even higher than just simply the things that are recommended for you. Kulu minan tayyibat. Partake from those things which are pure. Pure enough for whom? Ya ayyuhar rusul, kulu minat tayyibat. Pure to the level of the things that the anbiya and mursaleen themselves would have partaken in. Don't drop your standards, your level of the things that you surround yourself with, the things that you partake from, the things that you organize for yourself to be anything lower than that of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam's level himself. Yesterday, we started to reflect on an example of a mas'alah. We gave the example of the issue of eating meat today. And arguably, eating meat, or rather we should say, the industrial level that we are producing meat is causing the greatest level of methane output. And arguably this level of methane output is the greatest contributor to greenhouse gases and global warming. We asked the question, how do we deal with this? How do we relate the scientific literature to the ayat and to the ahadith? We found yesterday that there were certain narrations of Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam whereby they would actually prohibit or temporarily place a barrier on the consumption of certain types of foods, certain types of meats, because there was a greater need that the community had to be able to endure. Domesticated donkey was a carrier, was a worker for the community. They used to be able to carry their weapons to the battlefield on them. If people ate from those donkeys, wiping out the availability of that animal, how would they have carried mass number of weapons to the Battle of Khaybar? They wouldn't have been able to. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam temporarily banned the consumption of that thing because it was a greater need for it, which was the protection of the ummah. Similarly, what we could take away from that is that maybe for you and I, when the Maraja al-Kiram navigate these issues, whatever the issue may be, it might be plastics, It might be eating meat. It might be the spread of certain chemicals into the earth. We can think about either the temporary prohibition of these things, or to emphasize the absolute reducement of the partake of those things by virtue of the example of these ahadith that we found yesterday from our 6th Imam and our 5th Imam, Jaffar Ladak and Muhammad al-Baqir, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhima. So now, once we've seen this series, and we've seen all of these different examples being given, where does the ummah start? How do we organize ourselves in such a way that we can begin to implement some of the lessons that we have been taking in this series? Isalat al-Nizam provides us that principle. And what you'll find is that throughout the examples of Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam, when they organized their towns, they organized their houses, there were principles set down to be able to reflect the protection of the environment as the first and foremost point of the organization of everything that they did. That's a heavy statement. Think about that. Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, when they established a city, amongst the first things that they did was establish modes of protection for the environment. When they established their own houses, they did the same. Now, yesterday I gave you the example of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam telling us that there is even the wording of warming. So now I don't think you'll be too surprised when I tell you that Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam established, they had the nizam, the whole organization of cities, the whole organization of their life around the protection of the environment. Because by now you know that if I'm going to make this claim, I'll provide you the evidence of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam doing this. What I want you to think about, because we'll get there through the discourse, is the following. What I want you to think about is, what are our leading Islamic cities and whether they reflect the organization of environmental protection? What I want you to think about, and this hits home, especially our brothers and sisters who are doing so much work here tonight, every night, will continue on until the 13th of the holy month of Muharram. How do we ensure even our majalis of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam is reflective of these principles that are laid down for us? You see, if we come to the majlis, and even though we have been speaking about environmental protections, reduction of plastics, making sure there's reduction of meat, these are the greatest things that we can do to be able to protect the environment, to stop the polluting of the environment. There has to be the application of this into our own majlis, into the organization of our own communities, into the organization of our own towns and cities. Otherwise, what is the purpose of being able to listen to these majalis if we are unable to actually reform and implement them into the practical things that we do on the basis of our own life? So for tonight, inshallah, we want to go towards this conclusion. How is it Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam gave us the examples of applying these things into the structures of our systems and lives, such that we can ensure that we do so the same way? You know, sometimes I like to hand out gold stars. I say 10 points for a right answer, gold star for a right answer. Who can tell me, in the Islamic corpus of traditions, in the Islamic history, what is the term for the protection of environmental areas in and around the city? Does anyone know? The answer is Hema. The first thing that the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, did when entering into the city of Medina al-Munawwarah was to establish what we would know today as a green belt, as a protected area that had to be safeguarded for the sake of development and environmental practice. This is well established. In fact, there are entire theses and books written and dedicated to this subject. Think about this for a second. We may not know this because we have not studied the life of the Prophet. We are very interested in the debates. We're very interested in getting one over on those people who disagree with me and making sure that I avail myself of this knowledge. But how the Prophet organized the city of Medina al-Munawwarah as the example is very unknown. When the Prophet came, he organized an area called the Hima area, which actually set off or offset an area that had to be protected, a wilderness area that had to be protected. In fact, he did this several times in the city of Medina. There is a work which is called the Haramain or the Haraman and the Hima, and it actually looks, it's by an author called Muhammad ibn Salih. He actually looks at the whole example of the Prophet in establishing this in his city, Medina al-Munawwarah. There were several areas. Hima al-Naqi is another area where they set green belts and organized areas for grazing, organized areas that were supposed to be secure, organized areas that were supposed to be for plantations. Now ask yourself this for a second. Why would the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam do this? Why would he establish and begin his movement in this way? Unless that he wanted to show us that the nidam, the organization of the environment, of the places in which you live and frequent, is at the foremost of what you and I need to do when we begin to live, when we begin to participate in any particular thing. It wasn't only the Prophet. Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam did this practice as well. In Nahj al-Balagha, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, wrote a famous letter to his governor Malik al-Ashtar. Who knows which letter is this? Letter number 53. This letter is so famous that it's even reached the United Nations, hasn't it? You know, and every time we talk about great government, everybody immediately goes where? Letter number 53. Read this letter, Malik al-Ashtar. Read this letter, how Imam Ali alayhi salam advances good governing principles to Malik al-Ashtar. There is none of us here that have not heard of the greatness of this letter, I imagine. How many of us have actually read it? How many of us as leaders of organizations that have to govern organizations, Hussainiyat, Masajid, our own houses. Maybe you and I have charge of orphanages. There are people in various different roles within society that are managerial. I'm asking an honest question. How many of those Shia, how many of those Muslims have read the perfect work of governance when they themselves are managing organizations or managing things in the name of Islam? In this letter to Malik al-Ashtar, Imam Ali alayhi salam even talks about the protection of the environment and how to organize the environment. But when we organize majlis, or when we organize the Husayniyah or the masjid, we don't think about these things. We don't imagine that these matters come in. No, completely the opposite. Isalat al-nizam, the way in which we organize, has to be reflective of these principles and not the principles that we have grown up with, which are often based on consuming, which are often based on the lifestyles that we've been leading. I'm going to mention a few of this. This is from Imam Ali alayhi salam, letter number 53. Think about this statement from Imam. I'm going to read a couple for you from Imam Ali alayhi salam. O Malik al-Ashtar, you should keep your eye on cultivating the land more than you place importance on collecting revenue and taxes. Normally, a governor, what's his first thought? Where's the money coming from? Right? Now think about this. I'm not speaking specifically here of AIM, but often, every day we need to stand and we give an appeal, don't we? And what do we say? We need to be able to pay for these wonderful programs that throughout Muharram, Safar, we're going to be putting on. It's not free, is it? Just look around you. You have to pay for the hall. You have to be able to pay for the phenomenal equipment. You have to pay for the food. You have to pay. Everything costs, doesn't it? So of course there's going to be an appeal, isn't there? We need to be able to bring in the revenues so that we can actually pay for this. It's not free. No problem. I agree. Do it. What does Imam say is the first priority, even before collecting revenues and taxes? O Malik al-Ashtar, you should keep an eye on the cultivation of the land, the protection of the land, the way in which you deal with your environment, more than you keep your eye on collecting revenues and taxes. So what comes first? Environment. Because if there is no proper environment for you, then there's not going to be any taxes anyway. If we are struck by a virus and we're all out of work because we're sitting at home in a pandemic, how are you going to be able to raise the funds for the majlis? Everyone's out of work. So if you protect your environment, people can live properly, people can earn properly, then they'll be ready to be able to produce, which brings in the taxes, which brings in the revenue. Can you see that? Can you see the order of it? This is Isalat al-Nizam. The way in which we organize ourselves. Imam Ali alayhi salam continues. You should keep your eye on cultivating the land more than you keep your eye on collecting revenues. Because revenue cannot be had without cultivation of the land. Whoever asks for revenue without cultivation ruins the area and brings devastation upon people. His rule will only last for a moment. It's the wrong way round. Nothing we do will have any longevity in it if we're not considering the foundations first and then what we build on the foundations thereafter. Another hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. Imam Ali alayhi salam says the following. A person came to him and asked him to advise him about reclaiming and redeveloping abandoned land. Imam Ali alayhi salam responded by saying, partake of it, so long as you are a benefactor and not a spoiler of it. You are a cultivator and not a destroyer of it. And this is very important because I'm going to come back to this hadith in a few minutes' time. But again, see how Imam Ali alayhi salam talks about the organization of it and thinking about our own responsibility with the things that we do. Another hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. Indeed, the livelihood of people are found in 5 matters. Your ma'isha is found in 5 matters. Good leadership, sound cultivation, fair economy and commerce, good leasing, good rent, and good charity. These 5 things will secure a positive way of living, a good ma'isha for you, Imam Ali alayhi salam says. Now, if you'll open your Qur'ans, inshaAllah, let's go back to our durus. And you can start, inshaAllah, with Surah Al-Hajj, chapter number 22, verse number... I haven't written the verse number. It might be 16, it might be 26. It starts وَإِذَا بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ. Is it 16 or 26? 26. Jazakumullah khair. Everybody turn to chapter number 22, Surah Al-Hajj, verse number 26. Where do we start? How do we start this Isalat al-Nidam? Making sure that the organization of our ummah, the organization of our masajid, the organization of our programs are reflective of these points. Where do we need to begin? The first thing we have to realize is that when Islam is being presented to the world, where are the first places that people think about Islam? You ask the ordinary person, where do you think about Islam? Where's its base? What will they say? Makkah. They will say Makkah, they will say Medina, correct? If Makkah and Medina do not represent the highest nidam and Islamic eco-ethics, then the rest of the world will not reflect it. You understand? If Islam proper is not going to be in Mecca and Medina, then where can you hope for it to be? Look at this verse. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَإِذْ بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ مَكَانَ الْبَيْتِ. Now, do you remember I said to you that the Arabic word that we use today for environment, what is the word? Bi'a, ahsantum. وَإِذْ بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ. Bi'a comes from this word. It comes from this root. So when we say environment, what we actually mean to say is that that land that is assigned, that land that is made for you, bi'a, that environment, that land that is for you. وَإِذْ بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ مَكَانَ الْبَيْتِ أَنْ لَا تُشْرِكْ بِي شَيْئًا. We assigned, Ya Allah, my notes have just switched off. I'm going to need some, if you can pass the phone, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair, Sayyidina. We need to be able to. Allahumma salli ala. And the third, inshallah, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Here we go. My apologies for the delay. For the love of the Imam of our time, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. You see, just go back to nature. All of this, technology, it's your downfall, right? What we find in this ayah of the Quran is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the first place, the first point of Islam is that Mecca itself needs to be purified and needs to be reflective of the highest principles, godly principles. and not to allow any type of shirk, not to allow any type of impurity to enter into the places where the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most perfectly reflected. Look at this verse. وَإِذْ بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ مَكَانَ الْبَيْتِ أَنْ لَا تُشْرِكْ بِي شَيْئًا وَطَهِّرْ بَيْتِي لِلطَّائِفِينَ وَالْقَائِمِينَ وَرُكَّعِ السُّجُودِ. When we assigned to Ibrahim the place of the house, saying, do not associate anything with me, purify my house for those who make the tawaf and those who stand to pray and bow and prostrate themselves. The central point was that the Islamic example had to be within the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost. This is mentioned in a number of other verses, chapter number 29, verse number 67, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. أَوَلَمْ يَرَوْا أَنَّا جَعَلْنَا حَرَمًا آمِنًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, have they not seen that we have appointed a sanctuary, Baytullah, immune from any evil, aminan, that is supposed to be perfectly protective and safe and secure for those who go into it, whilst yet, what do mankind do? وَيُتَخَطَّفُ النَّاسُ مِنْ حَوْلِهِمْ. Whilst mankind are ravaged all around them. In the rest of the world, man will do what it wants. But in the sacred places of Islam, they have to be able to represent Islam at the highest level so that people can look and say, this is truly what Islam is, and don't get confused between what Islam is and what Islam isn't. The problem is that when we go to Makkah today, do we find that? No. When we go to Medina today, do we find that? No. In the same way, when it comes to our own great places of Islam, Najaf, Karbala, when it comes to any other place that represents proper Islam, it is supposed to be governed. It is supposed to be established in the way of the example of Ahlulbayt, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhim ajma'een. Similarly, for our own selves, when we want to be able to organize anything for our own selves, it should be reflective of Islam's examples. Be it the majlis, be it our own homes, be it the Husayniyah. Because there's no point, and I know this is going to be very difficult for some people, there is no point in pointing fingers at Al Saud and saying, look at the way in which you have organized Makkah and Medina, how it is oppressive, how it does not reflect upon pure Islamic ideals, when if it is happening in our own cities as well. What happens in Najaf, what happens in Karbala, what happens in Qum, what happens in Mashhad, we should not be pointing fingers there if our own cities are not yet organized in the right way. And in the same way, in our own majalis, in our own Husayniyat, if the things that we are doing is going to cause environmental damage, if the things that we are doing is actually doing the opposite of what Islam asks for us, how then can we imagine blessings from Ahlulbayt alayhim wassalam? Think about this very carefully. We cannot criticize another person if we're doing exactly the same things. It's very tough for us to hear, but sometimes we have to be able to swallow our own medicine. Now, let's think about this a little bit and think about how we can help organize ourselves in these ways. When we say that Makkah should reflect the Islamic ideals and that Allah Jalla Jalaluhu said, purify my house from all shirk, from all dhulm, such that it is purely amina for everything. And the same goes for Medina, the same goes for Najaf, the same goes for Karbala, the same goes for here. It immediately makes us reflect on the things that we are doing even within our own houses, within our own majalis. Because here has to be a space that truly reflects on Islam. Imagine a non-Muslim walks in, imagine a non-Shia walks in. They want to learn Shiism. They want to learn Islam. If I am representing something wrong to them, they then misunderstand. They think this is Islam when it's not Islam. True or not? A person looks at Saudi Arabia today. Do they imagine that's what Islam is? Many of them do. They say, this is Islam. This is the land of the Prophet. And then we tell them what Saudi Arabia is doing is nothing to do with Islam. It is of this scholarly group. It is of this family. Do not associate these people with Islam. What happens when the same thing is happening with the Shi'as and the same thing is happening within our own cities, within our own grand cities that the Shia of Ahlulbayt alayhim salam control? Think about this very carefully. Hands up here who has been for Ziyarah to, let's say, Najaf, let's say Karbala. MashaAllah. May Allah take you every year, inshaAllah. How many here have been on the walk from Najaf to Karbala? MashaAllah. May Allah take you all every single year, inshaAllah. I want you to be honest with yourselves. How much pollution and disposing of things on the floor and the wastage of food did you see on those journeys? Be honest for a second. How much? A lot? Yeah. Be very honest with yourself. It's very tough to introspect and look at our own selves in the mirror. It is arguably the hardest thing to do. It is very easy for us to be able to look at other countries, to look at other groups. I want you to think about our own behaviors. When we go on Hajj and when we go on Ziyarah, arguably, this is one of the times in which we are the most polluting to the environment by virtue of the various cultures that have come into those practices of Hajj and Ziyarah. Yet Ibrahim alayhi salam was told by Allah, Tahhir bayti, purify my house. How do we marry up the Islamic command, purify my house, yet the way in which the Hajj has become one of the greatest pollutants? Or when we go on Ziyarah to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam, and all we are doing is using plastics and throwing it away. All we are doing is creating more and more garbage piles, and that there is no system in place to be able to deal with the amount of trash that we are using. And because we have not put systems in place, we, the Shia, then fall into these traps. And we just live and practice those same ways that we then criticize others for living. Think about it very carefully. I'm going to read to you from a study regarding Hajj and Ziyarah. We have to change ourselves first. We have to look at ourselves before we look at others. There is a doctor who has done a study on the environmental damage that we are doing with Hajj. And there are other studies on looking at the environmental damage that we are doing on Ziyarah. Dr. Husna Ahmed, CEO of the UK-based international development NGO Global One, created the world's first green guide to Hajj. I'm reading a section for you. Pilgrimage to Makkah, Hajj, is one of the oldest and largest religious tourism events in the world, ordinarily drawing some 2.8 million participants from around the world since 2011. On average, each pilgrim contributes 60.5 kilograms of CO2 per day. As a result of the transportation, the hotel stay, the meals, and the waste management that is in place. And of course, it begins to break down the way in which we are. Dr. Ahmed says, it is important that people realize that it's irresponsible to be able to take Hajj trips in the way in which it is being taken. because of the environmental impact that is being placed upon it. There are also studies done on Hajj and Ziyarah. I'll give you an example. In the UK CO2 per person cost is 9.7 tons of CO2 per year per person. Compare this with 15 days of Ziyarah, in which it is 1.1 tons per person because of the amount of wastage, food wastage that we are doing and things like that, plastics that we are using during our Hajj, during our Ziyarah. Look at these figures, 9.7 tons of CO2 per year per person in the UK, 1.1 tons of CO2 per person in 15 days on Ziyarah to Iraq. That means in 15 days, we use 11% of the amount that we use in the entirety of the year whilst we sit here in the UK. That is the amount that we are using. The study here done from Heathrow to Istanbul, Istanbul to Najaf, Najaf, Karbala, Kadhmain, Samarra, back to Najaf, looking at all of the air travel, looking at all of the hotel studies, looking at all of the food. In just 15 days travel, we do the same 11% output of the entire CO2 amount that we do in a whole year. Now think about it. You've all been on Hajj and you've been on Ziyarah. Be honest with yourselves. How much food do you see people taking when they go to the hotel in their buffet meals? Be honest, how much have you seen it? I've seen people, they get one plate, they pile on an entire chicken, probably half a goat is on that plate, they pick a little bit at it, and then they throw it away, they leave it. Have you seen it? Yes or no, have you seen it? Yeah, I've seen it. Do you know that up to, this is a very important statistic, listen to this, 30% of all food that is produced in the world goes to waste. Goes straight in the bin, or it is overproduced, we don't like the look of it, and we just throw it away. You know when you go to Tesco, you buy a packet of 4 apples, 6 apples, right? The color is very nice, isn't it? It's a very deep red or whatever. It's very round, isn't it? Have you ever gone and picked apples yourselves? Anyone here gone to strawberry picking? Anyone here gone apple picking? Yeah? It doesn't look like that. What it reaches into the store, it's not the same, is it? What happens is that when they pick these industrially, because we have become so used to seeing a very perfectly round apple, perfectly red apple, we imagine that that's the way apples are. They are not like that, brothers and sisters. They grow with all sorts of shapes and sizes, don't they? If you've ever been strawberry picking, if you've ever been apple picking, you will know this. Industrially, they throw away such a large amount of food because it doesn't look right. It doesn't have the right color to it. Yet there are millions of people around the world starving. You know this food wastage, the food that we don't finish, it goes into the bin? This 30% of all the food that goes into the bin goes into the landfill? This is the second biggest contributor of methane gas in the world. When you go on Ziyarah, I ask you how many people pile up their food and just throw it away every single day. When you go on Ziyarah, how many times do you go and you see people giving out plastic bottles? And what is it? You know, there's a famous saying, a person, you know, these companies that provide us these plastic bottles, they're not giving us water, they're giving us plastics. And it takes decades, centuries to break this down. One of the things we need to be able to do is to make sure that whenever there is something representing Islam is done in the name of Islam, it can no longer be at the level in which it is just reflecting Western consumerism practices. Brothers and sisters, when you do something in the name of Islam, make sure it reaches the level of Islam itself. The same way the prophets were told, Ya ayyuhar rasul, O messengers, kulu min at-tayyibat, partake from the purified things. Allah said to the mu'mineen, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, kulu min at-tayyibat. You too also partake from the purified things as well. When we come for majlis, if we see that there are practices that are going to impact on the carbon footprint, if it's actually going to damage the environment more, then we need to be able to stop these practices in this hall, in our own cities, in our own areas where Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam are. Otherwise, then we are actually going against their own dictates. How can we do something in the name of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam where it actually destroys the planet and goes against the mission of reform that he set out for you and I? I know it's very hard for us to hear. But think about this. Even in our own majlis, we need to be able to reduce the amount of meat we are giving. We need to stop the plastics that we are giving. Instead of giving bottled water, we can give a cardboard juice box in replacement instead. No one here is going to say, I'm not happy with juice. But just knowing that it has that impact positively, it reinforces that within the majlis of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, within the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, the practices that we are doing are actually going to help save the planet and not perpetuate the destruction of the planet. This is why we said earlier on, the hadith of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. Imam was asked, tell me how I should use this land that I have reclaimed, how I should develop this abandoned land that I am using. Imam said, partake of it as long as you are a benefactor and not a spoiler of the land. Partake in it as long as you are a cultivator of the land and not a destroyer of the land. If you and I are going to participate in something and it continues the destruction of the land, then we are going against the edict of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. Where do we start? We have to start with the places that reflect Islam, to make sure that they truly reflect Islam and not reflect the consumerism that we have grown up into. Makkah, first and foremost, tahhir bayti. We have to be able to purify it from all of these distractions. Go to Makkah, go to Medina, you find McDonald's, you find Burger King, you find names of celebrities that I can't mention on the pulpit because of their actions are so debasing. But yet, their shops in their names are sitting inside Makkah. Allah said, Tahhir bayti. Medina al-Munawwara, it is the same. And don't for a second think it is not in our own cities as well. I'm sure you have seen in the outskirts in Karbala, there are even factories for Coca-Cola and these things. How can you really say Tahhir bayti and that the land of the Ma'sumeen, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, are going to be the shining examples for you and I when we participate in the very same corruptions, especially on Hajj and in Ziyarah, that are corrupting the rest of the world? Similarly, you and I cannot organize our masajid and our Hussainiyat and even our majalis if it is going to be partaking in the same consumer corruptions that are set for you, the traps that are set for you by Western capitalism. I'll tell you a story. May Allah help us. I was at a mosque, had the opportunity, the honor of being a resident alim at a particular community. I mean, resident alim at 3, so it can be any one of them. It doesn't matter, the name isn't important. I want you to understand how we work as a Shia community. versus the ideals that Allah Jalla Jalaluhu has set for us. We had organized that for a period, we were going to now start the way in which our environmental practices were going to be reflective of proper Islamic environmental practices. We were going to cut out all non-reusables in the mosque, in the majlis of Imam alayhi salam. So you know those polystyrene plates, those polystyrene drink, for chai cups, and all of the plastic spoons and forks and knives, cut those out. And it was a policy that was going to be put in place. And like here, we were giving the address, we explained to people the damage, we explained what Ahlulbayt alayhim wassalam have said, we explained how the Quran has set for us, we explained that Islam in a religious setting has to reflect Islam proper. Because if you cannot have Islam proper in Makkah or in Medina or in Karbala or in Najaf or in the Husayniyah, then where are you going to have Islam proper? Everybody understood, everybody agreed. So we set it as a policy and gave warning. From now, no more will these polystyrene cups that take hundreds of years to disintegrate be allowed, and we will not give them out. Now think about this. How many people are there? In a majlis, sometimes there could be 100 people. Sometimes you have a Husayni of 1,000 people. Correct? So every day they are coming, Dhuhr, Maghrib Salah, they're coming for Thursday night, Jumu'ah, they're coming from Wiladat program, Istishhadat program. Every time they're giving out polystyrene cup. Tens of thousands of polystyrene cups every single month are being used. Every single month. By a Husayniyah, a place in the name of Sayyid al-Shuhada. So we said, from now on, no more. From a date, we are going to change the policy. We're not handing this out. All we ask of you is from this date, you start to bring your own cup from home. Bring your own from home. Why? So it's not disposed. You bring it, you drink it, you'll get your chai, you go home, you wash up your own cup, mashallah, no problem. Is this a difficult thing? Truly, is it a difficult thing for you to be able to bring your cup? Tell me, when you leave home, who here forgets their phone? Do you remember to bring your phone? Do you remember to bring your keys? Can you remember to bring a cup for your chai if you have chai? Yes. Day 1. 5 loudmouth people stand up and say, we don't like this. Like a child throwing their toys out of their pram. We don't like this. We're not dealing with it. We don't like it. Day 1. Day 2, day 3. By day 3, the policy that had been agreed by the committee, agreed by the community, spoken about by the ulama, begun, was rescinded. Day 3. Why? 5 loudmouth people. And in our communities, in our centers, it's not about intelligence. The louder you shout, the more problems you make, the more you're listened to. Think about this. Imagine how much of an example this community could have made. Imagine the reduction of the carbon footprint it could have made. It could have reverberated to other communities. We could have gone to other communities and been the example of what the Quran, Ahlulbayt alayhim wassalam, set as the standard. 5 angry people who didn't want to take personal responsibility for themselves stopped an entire community of thousands being able to move forward. Brothers and sisters, when you represent the school of Ahlulbayt alayhim wassalam, we are not supposed to be able to lower their name, their institutions to our low standards. raise ourselves to their standards. Ya ayyuhar rusul kulu min at-tayyibat. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu kulu min at-tayyibat. The expectation that is placed upon the AIM alayhimus salam is also placed upon me and you. In our own spaces of religiosity, make sure that we reflect this, and we will be able to raise ourselves properly, and then inshallah the rest of the world will be able to follow. Instead of us crying at these points and saying, what is happening? Why isn't the world changing? If our spaces do not represent and reflect pure Islam, then we have no hope for others to be able to make those changes. Tonight we have spoken about Hajj, about Ziyarah, about our Husayniyat, and our own homes. And inshallah, this series has been of benefit for you and I. Let us think about the practices that we do. Become conscious. Let us think about the practices that we do and try to reform ourselves. Let us think about the practices that we do and making the slow changes that we need to make in our own lives such that it reflects upon Islam proper. And if we can make these changes, then inshallah, the environment will get better quickly, and you and I can protect our own selves and the rest of the planet and the rest of humanity and creation off the back of that. Inshallah, this series has been of benefit to you, and you and I can make the changes that we hope to be able to make in our own communities, in our own homes, as an example for the rest of mankind. Tonight, you and I are reflecting on the martyrdom of Hazrat Qasim alayhi salam. What we have said tonight is that Islam has a nidam. Islam has a system. And when we participate in anything in the name of Islam, it has to reflect the highest ideal. Otherwise, we are dragging down the name of that event in the name of Islam. And then we said that the expectation that is upon us is the same level of expectation that is upon Ahlulbayt alayhim salam. Imagine a young boy that is being asked, what is your opinion of death? And his response is no less a response than you would have imagined to come from the mouth of the Prophet himself. No less a response than would have come from the mouth of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam himself. They are sitting in the tent, and the Imam grants them the opportunity to depart in the darkness of the night. None of the companions are willing to do this. You are free of your obligation to me. The Imams look at the shining face of Hussein salamullahi alayhi. How can we leave you in your time of need, Ya Aba Abdullah? The heart of the Imam is overwhelmed at this moment of commitment to him. At this moment, Qasim ibn al-Hasan raises his voice. He sees all of these adult male. He sees Abbas. He sees Akbar. He sees all of the companions like Habib. And he wonders to himself, am I going to get the opportunity to be able to serve like they serve? Can I raise myself to the same level of what Al-Abbas is? He asks, oh my uncle, is my name written amongst the shuhada for tomorrow? Imagine when a young boy is so desperate to emulate the highest standards around him that he brings forth this question from his heart: how do I reach what you are going to reach tomorrow? How do I partake in what you are partaking in tomorrow? Is my name written amongst the shuhada? To which he is asked, how do you see death? To which this young man responds by saying, death to me is sweeter than honey. When Qasim goes out, we are told in the Maqtal that he resembled Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. Think about this. That a non-ma'soom could rise to the level where someone in the crowd, the enemies, would ask themselves, is this Hassan ibn Ali himself? Because of the way in which Qasim was representing his father, his way was identical to his father. This is the example of Qasim for you and I.